Watch yourself. So Dale is introducing me. My name is Erwin Ackerman. My wife Mary is sitting over here as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. So my name is Erwin Ackerman, and my wife is Mary, and we are sponsoring this evening because we think healthcare is one of the more important topics, especially in this election year or even going forward, to get involved with and learn more about. Because as we get older, and we're all getting older, unfortunately, it becomes more and more part of our life. So that's why we're holding this meeting tonight. So we want to talk about healthcare in America today, and we brought a fellow named Avik Roy. Now it's A-V-I-K, so you would say it's Avik, but he pronounces it Avik. So any questions you have, it's Avik Roy. Okay. And I want to thank Dale for this association she's put together over the years, and her assistant Joyce for helping us to have you all here tonight. Healthcare is a major topic, as I said before, in the election cycle that we're going through now. And there have been many false stories out there, and stories that really scare everybody as to what is going on in healthcare today and how it affects us all. And we hope tonight to be able to put to rest some of those false stories that you read about all the time, but really is a scary stories. We'll have a chance for Avik to make his presentation, and then we're going to have questions after that. If you're hungry as well, you can start to eat dinner while we're into the questions, because it'll be ready for you as well. And then after we go till about 7:30, if anybody would like to stay on after that to have further discussions, the room is available, and Avik is available, or Avik is available I messed up. Avik is available to talk as well for further discussions. In the news recently, I don't know if you read the Wall Street Journal like I do every day, there have been a number of stories about healthcare. One being the Fifth Circuit in the United States, there was a case involving Obamacare. And what they did was they asked the Supreme Court to decide the case. And the Supreme Court said, no, we don't have enough facts yet. So they sent it back to the district court in the last couple of weeks. And Avik can talk to you about this. It's a fascinating case, and it's kind of circular reasoning how the court got through this whole situation, sending it back to the district court. So that's one area I think he would like to cover. Another area that is interesting is that in Medicare, the present administration is attempting to change perhaps the rules on Medicare, where they are willing, or they're suggesting to the states that the states receive these block grants from the federal government to be able to decide for the states themselves how they should spend monies on Medicare. And I'm sure he'll cover that topic as well. There'll also be discussions about prescription drugs and a number of other things. Let me just see. I really don't want to go into Avik's credentials. He'd be happy to talk to you about that. But he heads a nonprofit organization that is basically, their goal is patient-centered plan for near universal coverage, and at the same time provide permanent fiscal solvency for the health situation in the United States. But he can talk to you more about that as well. So I'd like you then to welcome Avik Roy tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Erwin, and I apologize on behalf of my parents for the way my name is spelled and pronounced. I promised myself that I would give my kids normal names, so my kids are Will and Charlotte, names that you cannot misspell or mispronounce. But what can I do? It does mean that my Twitter handle is one that nobody else has. I have like, my Twitter handle is AVIK, because who else would have that name, right? I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about my organization and myself and how I got involved in all this, because before I worked in the nonprofit healthcare think tank world, I did a bunch of other things. Let me tell you about our organization first. So our organization is called the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, which is a mouthful, I know. But the reason why it's called that, in part, other than because it signifies what we do, is because FREOPP was a name that nobody else had on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And we could have freeop.org as our website. So these things matter nowadays, as you know. So what's our mission? Our mission is to do public policy research that expands economic opportunity to those who least have it. Which may seem like, okay, yeah, it seems like a thing a lot of people might want to do. But here's what's different about FREOP, as we call it. Our values are that we try to find common ground between people who think they disagree with each other. We see ourselves as advancing both conservative and progressive values at the same time. We don't see politics as a zero-sum game in which for progressives to win, conservatives have to lose, or for conservatives to win, progressives have to lose. We actually think 80% of Americans, and actually polls show this, 80% of Americans believe that every American should have a fair shot at success, that what America stands for is the principle of equal opportunity. We may disagree about what equal opportunity means and how to achieve it, but if we share the value of equal opportunity, then what we're really arguing about is evidence. We're not arguing about values. And so in America, the conventional wisdom today is we're just divided on what America is and what it stands for, and our values, and good versus evil. Our view is very different. Our view is actually that we're united on our values, and most of us just don't have the platform to express that. So how do we actually implement that? How do we actually find ideas that represent both conservative and progressive values at the same time? The way we formulate that is we look for market-based ideas that improve the lives of Americans at the bottom half of the economic ladder. So people who are progressive, who want more social mobility, who want people who are struggling to have more of a chance of success, but are agnostic as to whether the government or the private sector is the vehicle for that, they might find our ideas interesting. And vice versa, people on the Republican side, people who are more conservative, who want the market to achieve that kind of social mobility, they'll be interested in our ideas too. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit that is funded by charitable donations, and I mention that because Dale told me you're all very loaded. And so if you're interested in learning more about how to support us, you can find Christina over there in the gray business suit, tall blonde, and talk to her about that. Or you can write your name and contact information on the FREOP notepads you have at your table and let us get in touch with you that way. So this is a picture of me on September 15th, 2008. Who remembers what happened on September 15th, 2008? That was the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And I was working on Wall Street at the time at JP Morgan, and this is a bar in New York called McSorley's Ale House. Those of you who are New Yorkers know that old bar. That was a long day for me and my friends. The way I looked at the financial crisis was that we, as a country, were on the same path that Greece was, but at a much bigger level. There was no bigger country to bail us out. When you look at our deficit and debt and the things that the financial crisis really elicited about where America's weaknesses were, what's driving that? What's driving our deficit and debt? This is a chart from the Congressional Budget Office, which, as you probably know, is the nonpartisan government agency that does the fiscal scores of congressional bills. And what I've done here is I've broken down their projection of long-term federal spending, and this is going by what laws are on the books today and what the government is obligated to spend today. And I've broken it into two categories: healthcare and everything else. And the y-axis on this chart is economic output, GDP. So as a share of GDP, where's federal spending? Actually, if you look at everything else, Social Security, the military, schools, it's actually pretty stable. What we spend on all those things, roads, infrastructure, it's all pretty stable. The only part of the federal budget that's growing as a share of our economy is healthcare. It's not just the 80-20, it's like the 100-0 of federal spending. Well, that's not completely true because there's another category of federal spending that's growing called interest on the federal debt. So we're never going to get to 2050. This is a 75-year chart. I know these numbers are hard to read, especially for those of you in the back of the room. You're never going to get to 2050 on this chart because China will pull the credit card. The credit card in America is effectively treasury bonds. And when the rest of the world concludes that we're broke, they'll stop buying our treasury bonds, and that will drive up their interest rates. And that will mean this yellow part of the chart will go even higher. And who will suffer if we have to engage in draconian cuts to federal health care spending because of our inability to pay treasury bonds back? The vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, the sick. Those are the people who depend on federal health care spending. Those of us who are loaded, we can afford private health care. But those who cannot, they depend on federal health care subsidies to afford the health care they need. And so if we cannot afford to pay for that federal health care, those are the people who are going to suffer. The debate we have about healthcare in America is often described as, well, if you want everybody to have healthcare, you're a socialist. And if you don't want everybody to have healthcare, well, that's the nature of capitalism. In a capitalist or free market system, that's just the nature of life. There are going to be people who are uninsured. But this chart, this table, and again, I apologize if you can't read the numbers. I'm happy to send the slides to anyone who needs them. And I'm going to bombard you with a lot of charts today and tables, so forgive me. The United States, according to the Heritage Foundation, which is a well-known conservative think tank in Washington, the United States ranks 12th in their World Index of Economic Freedom. There are 11 countries that rank higher than the United States on economic freedom, all of whom have universal health insurance except for the United Arab Emirates, which ranks 9th. So you hear people say, well, if we have universal health care in America, if every American has health insurance, well, that's the end of freedom. That's the end of free markets. No, it's not. Actually, there are lots of countries that are economically freer than the United States that have universal health insurance. And that does not mean that their health insurance systems or their health care systems are freer than America's. But some of them are, particularly Singapore and Switzerland, which we'll get to a little later. So the point, yeah, go ahead.
Before Obamacare came in, where did the United States rank?
I'll put it this way. Before Obama became president, America, I believe, ranked 6th and then decreased to 12th. But a lot of that wasn't necessarily Obamacare. There were a lot of other policies in the Obama administration. You could talk about Dodd-Frank, you could talk about other fiscal policy, you could talk about regulatory growth, environmental policies, things like that. There are a lot of things that go into that. And healthcare was one of them, you could say. But the point is, yeah, sure.
I just got this from the club.
Okay.
Can you hear me? There's a black Audi A6 CT plates is blocking valet. They need the keys because you're blocking whoever it is.
Black Audi with Connecticut plates blocking the valet. Whoever's got an Audi with Connecticut plates.
A6, what is it called?
Audi A6? Yeah.
A6 is blocking. We need the keys.
Okay,
Does
so
anyone here have that car?
nobody's raising their hand as far as I can see.
There's a Yale Club.
Oh, there's a Yale Club event
so that
down the
might
way.
be up there.
Okay, so the Yale's causing problems as usual. No problem. Okay, so here's another chart, and again, don't worry about trying to read the fine print on this chart. What I'm trying to show you with this chart, this is probably the most important chart I'll show you today. It's the one that really woke my eyes up to the opportunity to bring conservatives and progressives together on healthcare. And what this chart is showing you is, you're familiar with the data that shows that America spends the most as a share of our economy on healthcare, and we don't get the best results. We have a lot of people uninsured, our outcomes aren't as good, et cetera, right? This chart is showing you something different. What this chart is showing you is government subsidies per capita of healthcare. The U.S. subsidizes healthcare at a higher rate per capita than all but 2 other countries in the world. And this is before Obamacare, to the question that was asked earlier. Before Obamacare, the U.S. was subsidizing healthcare per capita at about $4,160 for every man, woman, and child in the country, which is higher than all these other countries to the left that have universal health insurance.
There's a reason for that, right?
Well, we're going to get to that. Don't worry. So here's Canada. Here's the UK, for example. So you'll hear people say, well, we should have a single-payer system, because if we had a single-payer system like the UK and Canada, we'd actually spend less on healthcare per capita than we do today. And we'd actually subsidize healthcare less per capita than we do today. That's true. But there are also a lot of countries that have market-based healthcare systems that spend less on healthcare than the United States. And we're going to talk about some of those today as well. Now, as you may remember, we brought up Obamacare already today. 10 years ago, when Obamacare was being passed, Republicans talked about it as the government takeover of the U.S. healthcare system. You'll remember that. And I think everyone agrees that under Obamacare, the federal government has more of a role in the healthcare system than it did before. If you're on the left, that's a virtue. If you're on the right, that's a vice. But I think we all agree that that's true. And one way to measure that is by the amount of federal spending that Obamacare dedicated to solving the problem of people who didn't have health insurance before. And basically, as Obamacare got up and running, it spends about $200 billion a year trying to cover the uninsured, which is a lot of money. The federal defense budget is $800 billion a year. So we're spending about a quarter of the defense budget trying to cover the uninsured. So it's a massive undertaking, right? But in fairness to Obamacare, Obamacare actually cut Medicare by $800 billion over a 10-year period to try to offset that higher spending. So if you net that out, it's more like $75 billion a year in increased spending, which is still a lot of money, but maybe less than before. But then you have to ask the question, how much was the federal government already spending on health care before Obamacare? And that's what this orange set of bars is going to show you. So since the Sailfish Club is not 5 stories, I'll compress this chart for you. So this is what we've been arguing about for the last 10 years, the blue bars. And the orange bars represent the real government takeover of the healthcare system, which happened in 1965 when we passed Medicare and Medicaid. That's what the orange bars are. So all this arguing we've been doing about Obamacare, whatever you think of Obamacare, it's missing the forest for the trees. The real problem, if you care about the debt and deficit and the unaffordability of our system, from a spending standpoint, from a government spending standpoint, is the orange. And by the way, if you have Medicare for All, the Bernie or Elizabeth Warren plan, here's how much more federal spending there would be on health care in the United States. Now, Bernie would argue that that's money we're already spending on health care through the private sector. But the point is, if you're concerned about how much your tax would have to go up, how much the federal government can afford to cover, to pay for all this, we can't afford what we're already spending, and we're not going to find the tax revenue to do this. It's not going to happen. So the degree that politicians are talking about Medicare for All or hoping for Medicare for All, the fact is Medicare for All is not going to happen. For better or for worse, whatever you think of Medicare for All, it's not going to happen. Now, that is not to say that the status quo is wonderful. Not at all. So one of the biggest trends in this century, in the last 20 years, about healthcare spending has been what's happened in that private sector piece of healthcare. So what I'm going to show you here, and I know we have a lot of people who are from or around the hospital industry in the room, what Medicaid has paid hospitals over the last 20 years on an inflation-adjusted basis is roughly flat. It's tracked inflation. Same with Medicare. Medicare pays a little bit more than Medicaid. Medicare, for those who don't know, and I think most of you do know, Medicare is a federal program that funds health care for people over 65. And Medicaid is a program that funds health care for people who are in poverty or disabled or things like that. And there's some overlap between the two, so I'm oversimplifying. Here's what employers, people in the private sector, have paid for hospital care over the same period. It's skyrocketed. We're at a point now where the average private insurer, the kind of private insurance you get from an employer, if you're under 65, is paying 2.5 times for hospital care what Medicare and Medicaid are paying. So you can understand the appeal, even if you're a conservative, you should understand the appeal of Medicare for All, because if you're in this bucket, you know you're getting ripped off. Medicare and Medicaid are getting a much better deal than what private insurers are paying. So to the degree that people say, well, it's terrible if the government runs your health insurance. a lot of people look at this chart or something like it and say, you know what? It may be terrible if the government runs my health insurance, but I can't afford what I'm paying for health insurance through my employer. So I need something else. Here's another way to think about the same concept. So this chart, and again, I know the numbers are hard to read because they're in blue, but what this chart is showing you is for the average household in America, how much of their money did they send to the IRS every year? So the average household in America makes $62,000. And of those $62,000, 13.5% go to the IRS in the form of income taxes and payroll taxes and things like that. Here's the average household's share of what we spend on hospital care in America. If you take the national amount we spend on hospital care, which is over $1 trillion, and divide it by all the households in America, it represents 15% of the average household's income. And that's not what they're themselves paying to hospitals as patients. It's also what portion of their insurance premiums cover the hospital care of all people who have that insurance policy, and the percentage of their taxes that go to pay for other people's hospital care. You add all that up, it's 15 to 16% of their income. The point is, as a politician, you can talk about tax cuts all you want, and you're not going to make a difference for the average household anymore. The only way you're going to make the difference in the average household's living standards is by tackling the cost of healthcare. By the way, I'm obviously picking on hospitals a little unfairly here, but if you add in drugs and doctors and lab tests and everything else, this number is even worse, right? So the point is, the biggest threat to American living standards is not the tax rate. It's not even economic growth, per se. It's really the rising cost of hospital and healthcare. And again, so one thing, and we were talking about this in the cocktail hour with some of you, one of the things you hear people say is, well, the reason why healthcare in America is so expensive is because we're lazy, we don't exercise, we eat Doritos, or whatever it is. I know Palm Beach, everyone's healthy, but in other parts of the country, maybe not so. But here's the thing. We're actually more efficient than other countries at getting people in and out of the hospital. The average American hospital stay is 6 days compared to the average of 8 days in the industrialized world, which means for those extra 2 days, you actually save a lot of money not being in the hospital, because staying in the hospital, as you know, is really expensive. That's one metric. I could give you a lot of other stats. I'm going to bombard you with statistics, but not that many. But here's the thing. The average day in the hospital in the U.S. costs 5 times as much as it does in other countries. And that's not because we're doing 5 times as much stuff to the patient. It's because the price that we're charging for the MRI and the respirator and the hospital bed is 5 times higher in the U.S. than it is in those other countries. Okay, I'm going to stop picking on hospitals now. Let's talk about other parts of the healthcare sector, right? Because hospitals are the number one component of healthcare spending, but the 2 other bigger ones are doctor services and drugs. And particularly that's true for the non-elderly. So if you're under 65, you're not going to the hospital as often as you are when you're older. So it's the physician piece and the drug piece which actually take a bigger role in the costs that people with private insurance who are under 65, who get it from their employer, for example, deal with. So if you go to the doctor in America, the cost is 3 times higher than it is in other countries, and that's for primary care. You all know that we pay more for prescription drugs in the U.S. than we do in other countries. We pay basically double per capita for prescription drugs than we do in any other country. But here's the crazy thing. This is the crazy thing. Okay? It's not that we spend double of what other countries spend. It's this. That we're actually the most efficient country in the world at substituting branded drugs that are costly for inexpensive generic drugs when they're warranted. So if you need to take a statin to lower your cholesterol, we are the most efficient country in the world at substituting branded Lipitor, which is made by Pfizer, with a generic version of atorvastatin, for example. Way more efficient than France, where the rate is 30%. Over 90% of prescriptions in the US now are for generic drugs. So think about that. We're the most efficient country in the world at substituting cheap drugs for expensive drugs where they're warranted, and yet we're still paying double as overall on drugs that we spend for other countries. And this is what we spend on generic drugs. It's been stable. Even though the percentage of the prescriptions that are generic has gone up, the dollar amount we're spending has basically stayed the same, about $50 billion a year for unbranded generics. Here's how much we've been spending on the 8 to 10% of those prescriptions that are branded. It's gone up to $379 billion a year, and that number is up 67% in the last 6 years. Think about that. So you hear drug companies say, well, we've got to charge high prices because it's the cost of innovation. The cost of innovation has not gone up 67% in the last 6 years.
Wasn't there a contract between Obama and the drug company saying that they were not allowed to negotiate the cost of drugs when they put the
So the question is, wasn't there some deal between the drug industry and Obamacare or Obama on drugs? And the short answer is yes, and we can get into that more in the Q&A. Dale asked me to not get into too much of the questions now because I want to get through my presentation and we can talk about it more at dinner and afterwards. Here's another way to think about this. So among branded drugs, the drugs that are not generic, there's the traditional pills like Lipitor that are simple chemical constructs. The spending on those drugs is basically stable because they're balanced out by generics. But the newer wave of biotechnology drugs that are like monoclonal antibodies and these other things that use newer technologies to be synthesized and manufactured, that's where all the spending is. Why? Because due to obscure and technical rules from Congress and the FDA, there's basically no generic market for these drugs. So where monopoly power is strongest in the drug industry, that's where the prices have gone up the most. I promise you it's not because small molecules are more expensive to develop than biologic drugs. The clinical trials cost basically the same. The difference is that there's more pricing power among biologic drugs. And I bring this up to illustrate that monopoly power is driving a lot of the problems we have. Okay, so I'm going to pause with the charts, or at least a certain kind of chart, and I'm going to try to synthesize what we've learned so far. So how do we get from the old world of, the Marcus Welby type doc who comes to your house and does a house call and takes his time with you to the planet-destroying entity that's unaccountable that we have today? And I'm going to try to summarize in one chart and one man. The man is LBJ. So you may remember that when Medicare and Medicaid were being debated in the mid-60s, the biggest opponent of socialized medicine and a greater government role in the healthcare system was the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association was adamantly opposed to federal involvement in healthcare because the AMA was worried that if the federal government was spending the money, the federal government would tell doctors what to do. And in fact, they hired a then unknown actor, or less well-known actor called Ronald Reagan, named Ronald Reagan, to actually record a record that would be played at coffee klatches around the country to explain why socialized medicine was really terrible. So LBJ made a deal with the AMA. He said, look, I'm tired of you yelling about my Medicare bill. What if we said that you could charge your usual, customary, and reasonable rates, and we won't tell you doctors how much to charge? We'll just pay the bill. Would you then shut up about my Medicare bill? And the AMA said, fine, we'll shut up about your Medicare bill. And that is how we got to where we are today. So the way I'm going to simplify this is this. 1965, the government said, for understandable reasons, if you're retired, if you're poor, you can't afford health care in America, we want to solve that problem, so we're going to subsidize health insurance for those of you who can't afford it. But we're not going to tell doctors or hospitals or drug companies what to charge. They can charge whatever they want, we will write the check. That was a critical decision. Why? Because you make healthcare free for people, or somewhat free for people, or certainly freer than it was before, and how do consumers behave in any economic setting? They're going to behave like me at an open bar at an in-law's wedding, where I'm not going to order the Bud Light, I'm going to order the fanciest top shelf thing you got, because I'm not paying for it. And that's how consumers have become about our healthcare system. We say, you know what, we want the best healthcare we can get. We have insurance, we have coverage, we paid for it, or so we think. And what happens? Doctors, hospitals, lab companies, drug companies raise their prices because they know the consumer doesn't care what the price is because the patient isn't directly paying the bill. And then the bean counters in Washington wake up and say, wait a minute, we're spending way more on healthcare than we thought. Here's a point of trivia. So in 1965, when Medicare and Medicaid were being debated in Congress, Congress estimated that by 1990 we'd be spending $10 billion a year on Medicare. Does anyone know what we actually spent on Medicare in 1990? $110 billion. Now we're spending $900 billion on Medicare. are going to head to $1 trillion soon. So why is that? The government thought Medicare costs would go with inflation because they did not realize that patients would be like me at an open bar. And that's not to trivialize how serious healthcare and healthcare needs are. It's just to illustrate the economic fact of if you need healthcare and you are insensitive to cost because you're not paying for it, you're going to demand the best the care you can get, and you're not going to care about the price because you're not paying for it. So the government tried to backfill. Of course, you're not going to kick seniors off Medicare. We all know how that would go. So what they did instead is say, well, we're going to turn insurance companies into the bad cop, try to get them to say no to patients, and we're also going to try to eke down what we pay hospitals and doctors in order to solve our budget problems. So hospitals said, well, of course, the government can do what it wants, but we can tell private insurers what we want. And so hospitals around the country started merging into regional hospital monopolies so that they would have the market power to charge what they wanted to charge, raise prices, and then because insurers are not in the business of going broke, they pass those higher prices on to consumers in the form of higher premiums. And we wake up in 2008 and say it's really terrible that 50 million people living in the United States can't afford health insurance, so we come up with the brilliant solution of subsidizing health insurance for more people. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't want every American to have health insurance. It's to say that the peculiar and particular way we've done it in the United States is the worst of both worlds. You can have a coherent system that's a single-payer system, which the government controls everything, controls the prices, controls what you're allowed to do as a patient, and that can work budgetarily. You can have a market-based system in which people compete to serve you as a patient, just like they do in the rest of the economy, and you subsidize the cost of coverage for people who need that help. But what we've done is the worst of both worlds, where the government subsidizes healthcare for almost everybody, but doesn't do anything to regulate the cost. And so the costs end up being a runaway fiscal nightmare. So you remember 10 years ago, we were told that Obamacare was going to solve all these problems. Obamacare was a law that was supposed to achieve universal coverage, right? We weren't supposed to be having a debate in 2020 about universal coverage because that was already done 10 years ago. But why didn't it happen? It didn't happen in large part because the much-touted Obamacare health insurance exchanges where people would buy subsidized and regulated private insurance didn't enroll as many patients as they were supposed to. When Obamacare was passed in 2010, the Congressional Budget Office predicted that about 25 million people would be signed up for coverage on healthcare.gov and similar websites around the country. But every year they decrease their estimates, and today only 9 million people are signed up for health insurance on those websites. Why is that? Because the regulations in Obamacare doubled the cost of health insurance for people who need to buy health insurance on their own, who don't get it from the government, who don't qualify for Medicare, who don't get it from their employer. And what happened was, one of the things that was actually sort of clever about Obamacare is that it gradually reduced the subsidies that you get as your income went up the scale. So if you're in a higher income bracket, you got less financial assistance, and that was designed so that you would still want to make more money. You wouldn't be discouraged from making more money because your assistance would taper off rather than being cut off completely. But what ended up happening is if your income was near the poverty line, you signed up for Obamacare because you're getting a free ride on your insurance premiums. But if you were making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year, if you're part of the working poor, you weren't getting enough of a subsidy to offset how high the premiums were. So I've complained a lot about the healthcare system. George Clooney is not impressed with my complaining. He wants to know what I would do to solve the healthcare system. And I'm going to go back to this chart that I told you was the most important chart that I've showed you today, which is government spending per capita on healthcare and how the U.S. is way at the high end of that list. And there are a couple of countries on the low end that I'm going to highlight. Singapore, which is the lowest, and Switzerland, which is the 5th lowest in terms of government spending per person on healthcare. And these are both countries that have universal health insurance, where everybody gets covered, everybody gets treated, and the life expectancy is longer than it is in the United States. And yes, there are small countries, and we can get into that if you want. But basically, what Switzerland has is a system that's kind of like Medicare Advantage for all, or Obamacare for all, where everybody has private insurance. There's no government public option, but people who are on the low end of the income scale get a subsidy to offset the cost of their premiums. And that system works extremely well and allows everybody to get coverage. Singapore has a slightly different system. They have a single payer catastrophic health insurance plan where it works more like car insurance, where if your car is totaled or it gets stolen, your insurance kicks in. Singaporean health insurance works the same way. You have a stroke, you have cancer, your health insurance kicks in, but for a lot of things that are under that, you have a relatively higher deductible where your health savings account, what we pay in Medicare and Social Security taxes, Singapore's version of that, they route into a health savings account, which then you use to pay for your everyday healthcare needs like checkups and things like that. And that system works really well in Singapore. So how can we learn from those two systems, not to just plop them onto the United States, but to gradually evolve the American system in a way that is more stable, covers more people, and is more affordable. And I'm going to break it down into 4 steps, and this is basically the FREOP, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. This is the healthcare plan that we've developed over many years of research. It starts with the idea of every American having a choice of what insurance they want to buy, just like those of you who are on Medicare Advantage do. So how many of you are on Medicare Advantage today? Raise your hand if you're on Medicare Advantage. Okay, a good chunk of you. And how many of you are on traditional Medicare? Okay, it's about half and half, and that's pretty typical, right? So there's the traditional Medicare, but when Bernie Sanders says Medicare for all, he means the government-run insurance company where only the government is the insurer. But actually, Medicare is more complex than that. Today, you can sign up for that traditional program, or you can sign up to get your Medicare benefit delivered by a private insurance company like Blue Cross or United Healthcare or Aetna or Humana. And that's how Obamacare works. Obamacare, you have a choice among a bunch of different private insurers where the cost of that insurance plan is subsidized. And that system actually works pretty well. If you look at Medicare Advantage's market share among seniors is growing every year. Today, 35% of seniors have Medicare Advantage plans. By the end of this decade, it might be half.
What is it?
What is Medicare Advantage? So Medicare Advantage is basically a system that was installed, let's call it about 30 years ago, plus or minus, where private insurers deliver the Medicare benefits. So everything that's covered by Medicare is covered by Medicare Advantage plans as well, but it's a private insurer that's delivering the benefit. And if and when the private insurers can deliver that benefit more efficiently at a lower cost, they're allowed to offer additional benefits. So for example, a lot of people with Medicare Advantage, their prescription drug coverage is included in their Medicare Advantage plan. Or they have dental and vision coverage included in their Medicare Advantage plan, things that are not covered by traditional Medicare Parts A and B. So for those reasons, among others, Medicare Advantage has become increasingly popular among seniors. So the idea here is what we can learn from both our own experience in America and the experience of countries like Switzerland is that there are ways to achieve private universal coverage through private insurance. There are certain brackets and certain frameworks you have to build around it, but you can do it. Medicare Advantage is showing that. Medicare Advantage is showing that private insurers competing against one another are actually delivering health insurance and coverage and care at a lower cost than the traditional government program. And there are ways to expand that to the rest of the country. If you think about Obamacare, it's private insurers again. The system doesn't work as well as it should for the reasons I described, but through certain kinds of reforms, particularly reforms that, one of the things about Obamacare is it basically makes health insurance, we know that it covers people with pre-existing conditions, right? Everybody knows that. But what people don't talk about is that in order to cover people with pre-existing conditions, Obamacare basically doubles or triples premiums for healthy people who are uninsured. So the people who are uninsured today are basically healthy people who can't afford, who don't have the income to afford a $400, $500, $600 a month premium. So there's a way to solve that problem. There's a way to directly subsidize the cost of coverage of people who are sick, people with pre-existing conditions, in a way that does not increase, in fact, dramatically lowers the premiums for healthy people who are uninsured, which are the majority. Most people are healthy. And those are the people who are uninsured today. So we can make their health insurance more affordable, and we can also expand choices for the people in the employer-based market today who are getting ripped off by the system. Their insurance is 2 to 3 times more expensive than it has to be. The plan of Pete Buttigieg and others, as I'll talk about, is to have a public option where, okay, you have your employer-based coverage, you'd have one other option that the government would supply that would be an alternative to your employer-based coverage. Well, why should we limit people to one other option? You don't have one other option when it comes to car insurance or life insurance. You have dozens of options. In Medicare Advantage, you have dozens of options. Why can't we give people dozens of options for health insurance too? Personalized options where they might have 12 or 20 different types of insurance that compete for their business. And we can do the same thing with federal employees and state employees, where instead of getting government insurance, they're getting private, individually chosen insurance. And by expanding and gradually transitioning our employer-based system, where an HR bureaucrat decides what kind of insurance you have, to a system where the employer gives you a certain amount of money, say $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, to go shop for the insurance you want.
That's taxable.
No, it would be, under this system, it would be tax-free. So that's the whole idea, is that you preserve the tax benefit of employer-based coverage, but you give the worker the choice, rather than the HR bureaucrat the choice of how to buy that insurance. So that's how you strengthen the role of individual choice in private insurance and competition in lowering prices. But competition in lowering prices among insurers doesn't work if the drug companies and the hospitals and regional specialist physicians still have monopolies and can charge whatever they want. So you have to reintroduce competition among hospitals and prescription drugs in other areas where they're absent. And I won't bore you with all the detail on this. We have lengthy white papers on this topic, and it gets very technical. But the basic thing is, what we do well in terms of generic drugs, we've got to apply to the areas where that's absent. Biologic drugs, complex drugs. There's a medicine or a therapy called Advair. Some of you may know. It's used for asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or smoker's lung. It's manufactured by a company called GlaxoSmithKline, a British pharmaceutical company. The drugs that are contained in Advair were first approved by the FDA in 1988. And yet that that treatment is basically still a monopoly today. Why? Because of a technicality around the fact the FDA would not approve as a generic any drug that had an inhaler that was just like, that was different from Advair's. But yet if your inhaler was the same as Advair's, you violated their patents. So you couldn't win. So there are dumb things like that go on all the time in the drug market that basically extend monopolies that should have expired a long time ago. And we can do a lot more to introduce and restore competition among big hospital systems as well. Then we can reform Medicare and Medicaid to reflect the same principles. Right now, if you're low income and you're in Medicaid, you basically have only one choice, the plan that the state has assigned you to get Medicaid. And because Medicaid doesn't pay doctors what other insurance programs pay, a lot of people with Medicaid don't get good access to care. If you integrate them into the Obamacare structure of people shopping for individual coverage that's subsidized, then it's a much more fluid system. Your income goes up or down, you're still in the same system, you can see the same doctors. And same thing with Medicare. We can do more to encourage and expand the role of Medicare Advantage in providing lower cost options for seniors and lower cost options for taxpayers. And of course, we should do all the other things we talk about. We should reform the malpractice system. We should reform the way digital health information works in America, because right now, due to a lot of outdated technology and privacy laws, if there's an entrepreneur or a technologist who has a great way to take your patient data with your permission and do something useful with it to coordinate care between you and your cardiologist and your endocrinologist in the hospital, they're not allowed to, because of anti-kickback rules, because of privacy rules that were designed for a different age, an age of even fax machines and stamped postal mail, right? So we got to reform those laws, and we're making some progress on that. Why don't we give veterans the same ability to get outside of the VA system and choose the care and coverage that they want? You add all this up, and it would reduce federal spending over the next 30 years by $10 trillion, that's trillion with a T, and reduce the deficit by $8 trillion, because there would also be tax cuts aside with it, or revenue losses aside with that. It would make the Medicare Trust Fund permanently solvent. So everyone on Medicare today would know that Medicare will be there for them throughout their entire lives. And state budgets would stop being crowded out by Medicaid, because states would get relief from the fiscal pressure that Medicaid is putting. You want to know why your state is having a tough time funding schools and roads and firemen? It's because Medicaid is eating more and more of the state budget. We estimated that based on our plan, 12 million more people would have health insurance than do today under Obamacare, because we would reduce the cost of health insurance by 25%. So more people wouldn't have to be forced into the system. They'd voluntarily buy health insurance because it was less expensive and more affordable. And that's the key part of the bipartisan opportunity, that people would have better coverage, where more doctors would take their insurance, and so they could get the high quality care that they don't always have access to today. I'm going to wrap up by summarizing a couple of people who are actually working on these issues in the public sphere. One is Bruce Westerman. He's a congressman from Arkansas. You've probably never heard of him. He took Tom Cotton's seat when Tom Cotton went to the U.S. Senate. He's put out a plan called the Fair Care Act of 2019, which is based on the FREOP plan that I just showed you. It reforms the way private insurance works to reduce its costs. It expands the role of Medicare Advantage and private insurance competition in Medicaid. It reduces prescription drug prices through increasing the incentives for competition and getting outside of these dumb regulations that extend monopolies. And similarly with hospital care, basically regulating the way hospital monopolies work and then giving hospitals an incentive to divest and restore competition where that doesn't exist today. And also to reform digital health care so that more people can use their health information, more people can help patients use their health information in ways that improve their health outcomes. Pete Buttigieg I want to highlight on the other side. Pete Buttigieg is a guy who, as you know, he's opposed to Medicare for All. He says it won't work, but he's talked about Medicare for all who want it. And he defines that as a public option that would pay Medicare rates so that people in the employer-based system, if they wanted an alternative that was less expensive, they could have a public option. He talks about increased Federal Trade Commission enforcement of antitrust law to prevent anti-competitive practices among hospitals and others. And he talks a lot about Medicare directly negotiating drug prices. That's sort of what you might call the center-left policy menu of today. And so with that, let me tell you about our website. It's freopp.org, FREOPP.org. Our program is called Affordable Healthcare for Every Generation. It's called that because our whole idea is we don't just want healthcare to be affordable for everybody living today. We want to make sure that healthcare is affordable for the people who come after us. Because if we haven't done that, we have not truly made healthcare affordable. I know I've thrown a lot at you, so thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. And by the way, let me just say one more thing before we adjourn for dinner here, and that is that, we don't just work on healthcare at FREOP. We work on all sorts of issues that affect the living standards of Americans who are struggling today. We work on market-based solutions to lowering housing costs. We work on market-based solutions to lowering the cost of higher education. We look at criminal justice reform. So if you're interested in any of those topics, come find me afterwards and I can tell you more about our broader range of work. Thank you. Okay, Dale wants the mic.
We are going to have a different, they're going to assign tables to go and get the food, and so there's not a mad rush with everybody in it. So if, I think it's all ready, I hope. But if you want to talk, I have one question.
Yes?
How do we get what you're saying? Because I think it's fabulous.
Well, thank you. I would, one of the things that's been really interesting about this. So I was talking with somebody earlier who's saying, sounds really interesting, but I'm totally skeptical. There's no way that any of this is going to happen. So best of luck to you. And I'm like, look, the reason I went into this line of work is because it was hard. I could have kept, collecting a nice paycheck in the hedge fund business, and that would have been fine, and my life would be pretty good. But I wanted to be able to look back on my life when I was 75 and say, you know what? I tried to solve the hardest possible problem I could solve. And hopefully I succeeded. If I did, then I really left a legacy on this planet. And if I didn't, at least I tried. And the good news is we are making a lot of progress. It's not the kind of progress you will see in the headlines of the paper, because a lot of it is behind the scenes. What I found is that a big part of the heavy lifting in turning these ideas into law is to actually turn them into legislative form. So you may have a brilliant idea about how you want the healthcare system to look, but you have to turn it into legislative text. In other words, what aspects of the federal code would you change to achieve this result? And it's kind of like you may know what kind of house you want to buy or build, but you have to hire an architect and a contractor to build it. It's kind of like that. There's these people called legislative counselors, and they basically do this work of turning ideas into bills. And so over the last several years, we've done that work because of the leadership of this particular Congressman, Bruce Westerman, who came to me and said, I want to take this and I want to turn it into a bill. So we've done that now, and there are a bunch of other members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that are set to co-sponsor the next version, the updated version of this bill, which is going to be coming out in the next couple of months. And then from there you build. So I'm not saying this is going to happen in 2020, because the 2020 debate is going to be about Medicare for all and other things. But basically you get to a point where just like the Republicans had to fail on repeal and replace to find what I'm talking about more interesting. Similarly, Democrats are going to have to fail at Medicare for All to find this set of ideas more interesting, right? So both sides, in a sense, have to fail at the more partisan approach to health reform in order for something that is a more of a crossover to be appealing. And that's starting to happen. I talk to Democratic members of Congress all the time who say, look, I love a lot of what you're saying, but I have to support Medicare for All because I'm a Democrat and it's a presidential year and I can't betray my base in that way. But once we get through that process, and Medicare for All is either tried by the next Democratic president and fails, or it's rejected by the electorate, either way, you'll end up in a place where something like this is the skeleton, the baseline, the chassis for a broader set of reforms. And I'm not saying that every single idea that we've got in our plan is going to become law. But the basic concept is there. And I'll try to explain it a different way. So when Bruce Westerman, that congressman, came to me and said, as the Republicans were failing, it was sort of fall of 2017. So the Republican repeal and replace bill was failing. Everyone knew it was not going to pass. This was before McCain did his famous thumbs down thing. And he comes to me and he says, Ovik, I want to come up with a bipartisan health reform plan. And I said, well, sir, that's not the easiest thing to do. And he said, well, I still want to do it. I said, okay. Well, my suggestion to you, sir, would be come up with a plan that the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan scorekeepers in Washington, would agree increases the number of people with health insurance and decreases federal spending, entitlement spending on health care. Why? Because no Democrat is going to vote for a health reform bill that decreases the number of people with health insurance. And no Republican is going to vote for a bill that is destabilizing fiscally. So if you can get those two things together, increase the number of people with health insurance, but reduce the underlying cost of health care so the federal government's obligations are smaller, then you've got the spine of what could be considered a bipartisan health reform bill. So he said, I love it, can you send me some bullets? And that led to this 2 to 3 year process where we turned all these ideas into legislative text, and that's where we are today. So if you think about some of the other great accomplishments, policy accomplishments, whether you're right or left, the last 20 years, that's how they started. There's been a handful of people who've come up with the idea, and they've patiently built a movement and a constituency for that idea, and 6, 10, 12 years later, that idea becomes law. Right? And we're sort of in the middle stage of that. So we first published a version of this plan in 2014. It's now 2020. And so we're at the stage now where there's actually congressional legislation, which is incredible. If you think about most think tanks out there, in fact, no other think tank can say that their pet version of health reform is a bill. We're the only ones who can really say that right now. And I mean, of course, the ones who are saying single payer, Medicare for all, maybe you could say that, but that's an old idea. So I won't say any new think tanks or modern think tanks can take credit for that. So we've made that level of progress, and so now we have to take the next several steps to get from there to something that can pass. All right, let's eat.